So hello, everyone. It's wonderful to have you join this conversation for the class Food, Power, and Paradox, the role of the private sector or business in food and farm policy, where today we're really focusing on food enterprises and climate change, taking a dive into the paradigm shift that's needed from a fossil fuel-based agriculture to a more regenerative food system, and what the implications are, and even the agency is for city and subnational governments, not only national governments. So you're all involved deeply in the issues of climate and food systems. Yasmin coming from the farthest away in Argentina and working within the UNFCCC process, and you can tell us a little bit about how you do that. Peter, who's next farthest away in Washington State, who works with climate issues at various levels and has been for a long time. And Arthur Getz Escudero, who's in the American Southwest on the edge of Lake Mead, joining us. So I was thinking that in order of greatest to nearest distance, that we could perhaps roll from Yasmin to Peter to Arthur and carry on from there. So can I invite you, Yasmin, to quickly introduce yourself and share with us some reflections based on, I shared 3 questions with you that are whether you think there is real evidence for accountable and robust change in the food production, processing, transport, marketing practices in food and farm enterprises. Big question, your take on it from your perspective. And then what role the municipal and subnational government policy and those actors play in with it, either together with or in tension with national and international climate actors. So let me turn it over to you first, and thank you for being with us for a few minutes.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks, Thomas, and hello, everybody. So I work in an Argentinian NGO, which is called Environment and Natural Resources Foundation. And I engage, as you said, Thomas, with the UNFCCC processes. I have been doing that for a few years. So it's interesting to work both in an NGO, but also in the national and international spaces, because it provides like different views and tools to address climate policy and to interact with the political stakeholders. In terms of the first question, I think that maybe we should take a step back and really refresh for maybe some of those who might not be as deep into the Apollo sector, let's say. So I think that it's important to remind ourselves that emissions from the land use, or what we call in the climate space, the Apollo sector, is around 30% of global emissions. Of course, this varies from country to country. For example, in my country, in Argentina, it accounts for 39% of emissions. So it's almost more than a third, but not half of the emissions of the country. And so this means that it's one of the most important sectors to tackle, to transform in order to address climate change. And it's also a fundamental sector because it's the one that actually provides food and nourishment for society. So it has this, like a colleague of mine always says, that it's a sector that is a victim of climate change, but also is accountable for climate change. And so is this double role that makes such a complex issue in addressing the food production system, production, transportation, and all the moments and steps for food to reach consumers, let's say. But of course, we know that the different production systems have different emissions and impacts. And this relates, for example, to deforestation, to biodiversity loss, to ecosystems integrity, to resilience. The IPCC, for example, launched a few years now the special report on land, and it talked about how these different systems have different impacts. And for example, one of them that was mentioned was integrated systems such as agroecology. So we know that not all food production is the same, and not all food production has the same type of impacts. And that is an important thing to think about when we're talking about the food system transformation. And this not only relates to mitigation, of course, to adaptation as well, because it is a system that is very heavily impacted by changes in temperature, in rainfall, and also I think that when we think about the food system, it's important to have some general principles, let's say some global principles, but we need to address that in a more local or regional way. And I think that also comes into play when you were mentioning, Thomas, the role of municipal or non-state actors, because it's a matter also of climate justice. I mean, for example, just to give a concrete example, when we talk about the transformation that the food system needs, we talk about the need to, for example, consume less meat. And that makes sense for some parts of the world. For example, the US, Argentina needs to consume less meat. But does it make sense to have that same principle in, I don't know, say Nigeria? No. So we need to understand those complexities in order to understand how the food production system needs to change in different parts of the world. And when we talk about the private sector, I think it's important to understand that it's not the private sector as a whole. It's not homogeneous. We cannot talk about the ag sector as a whole without thinking about its history or its social economic dimensions. So I'm just trying to bring into some of the complexities and why this topic is so interesting and such a challenge as well. And maybe also to bring an example to understand how, for example, local governments or municipalities could have a big role in the transformation of the land use sector. For example, in Argentina, we have for a few years now a network of municipalities that promote agroecology. And this has been fundamental to really have local governments talking to agricultures hand in hand, like really having that space to deal with local needs, with local demands. And it's we always discuss whether it's better a bottom-up approach or a top-down approach. I think both things are needed, but I think that maybe trying to think about the local government's role is so important to bring the most, let's say, the biggest changes for the people on the ground. And I'll stop there, and maybe we can continue discussing.
Thank you. That was very, very good. I'm glad you took a step back and painted the bigger picture too. And we can come back. I'd like to hear more about the state of play, if you will, inside the climate negotiations around food and agriculture also, but we can come back to that. Let me turn to you, Peter. Building on what Yasmin has given us, what would you add from I know you work with some of the larger donors involved in trying to shift the paradigm here. And we heard Yasmin mention agroecology and the networks with local cities. Do you see a paradigm shift occurring that is actually being picked up by the private sector as well as by donors and others?
Thanks, Thomas, and thank you very much, Yasmin, for your comments. Do I see a paradigm shift? No, I see, in fact, intense efforts to maintain the existing paradigm, including through what's called the CGIAR Center, the Consultative Group for International Agricultural Research, which, for historical perspective, is a shell of its former self. It's very depleted, and most R&D, research and development, on behalf of agriculture or in the agricultural sphere is now private sector, and it's productivity focused. In some cases, it has a strong climate resilience component in terms of crop breeding and those kinds of approaches. But there remains in both the government sphere that Yasmin has described, as well as in the corporate sphere, an intense, even irrational distrust and misunderstanding of agroecology. And I think it's, if you're in the private sector, you've been trained to think in terms of market rationality. And market rationality is one of the things that's necessary to make a living in farming. But agroecology looks first at ecosystem integrity and ecological rationality. And in many cases, market rationality will flow from that. But it's a very different research paradigm, and it's been intensely resisted by, in the United States, by some of the land-grant universities, certainly the corporates, the USTR, the United States Trade Representative's Office, which negotiates only on behalf of large producers and exporters. And so agroecology continues to show promise for livelihoods, for restoration, for food security, for climate resilience. And at the same time, the dominant paradigm wants to minimize those achievements. So we still have a big problem in that regard. We also, in the global South, have a real basic problem of farmer rights, secure access to land, secure access to capital, and secure access to markets. And that's actually a big chunk of what my career is focused on. You can define rights in different ways. You don't have to use rights language at all. You can use market language, but it's really about building farmer power, organizing power, not just market power, but the ability to look at the ecology, to look at the landscape, to ask the right scientific questions, or to apply the correct and time-tested forms of traditional knowledge in service of those outcomes. And again, those outcomes often are not market-oriented. They are subsistence, and they are resilience-oriented. And this remains one of the big challenges. The other big challenge, and we should name it, it's no longer fashionable to talk about it, but it remains the power of the pesticide industry. And what the pesticide industry has learned is to be much, much less visible than they were 20 years ago. And some of that's happened through mergers and acquisitions, particularly with firms in the pharmaceutical sector. And so the agrochemical companies are doing their best to hide behind the current very positive image of pharmaceuticals post-pandemic, or as a result of essentially the vaccines being produced mostly with public money, but done through these private entities. So there's a little bit of them hiding behind that right now. But the agrochemical lobby remains hugely powerful, very tightly tied into the trade negotiators from the global north. And that's an essential piece of the paradigm that's being defended. The old paradigm that refuses to die, still very chemical centered, still very monoculture centered, still likes the idea of a blank slate monoculture landscape. And agroecology thinks in the opposite, which is niches, microclimates, local markets, etc. With respect to what local authorities might do, I'm just going to suggest two things that build on Yasmin's excellent comments. In cases where agribusiness has captured your national health policy or your national supermarket chains, what have you, they want to obscure the link between nutrition and health outcomes. And one of the things that big food constantly fights against is more nutritional disclosure. One of the things that local governments can do, it's usually within their power to do, is both compel greater disclosure of nutrition in food, but also to link it in substantive ways to health. People are familiar with the idea of a carbon tax or a fossil fuel tax. Local governments have the opportunity to play around with different tax or purchasing regimes through procurement and whatnot that would link nutrition to health outcomes, and they would make public procurement decisions based on that. The other thing that local governments absolutely need to do, and I'll just make this point quickly, is they need to worry about climate change adaptation. They need to worry about adaptation with respect to food security, with respect to the delivery infrastructure for food in cities. But perhaps most of all, it's social resilience. It's figuring out what are the varieties of collective care and management that will allow populations to get through extreme events, floods, hurricanes, the disappearance of vegetables from supermarkets shelves in the UK just in the last couple of months. Those kinds of things are going to happen as a result of climate change, and local governments need to be paying a lot of attention to adaptation. Thanks, Thomas, for this opportunity.
Well, Peter, that was, you started out dark and came to the light a little bit. And, I think following on what you said about the tremendous resistance against agroecology and against the other non-market related attributes of food systems, the economic and social and so-called external costs to food production systems. It is partly because of what you said in ticking off those non-market outcomes of the health, nutrition impacts of the food system that local governments are very attentive to now. The plant forward and food as medicine movements that are picking up. What you said, Yasmin, about the agroecology network in Argentina, and what local governments are being forced to think of, not just post-pandemic, but with the combination of various crises that are differently expressed in different parts of the world, which is really why the attention is coming from a number of sources to what the role of cities and subnational governments are with their partners, civic institutions, and other social movements. So, Arthur, let me turn to you. Where are the cracks in the pavement from your perspective? I mean, you have worked, as Peter knows, and Yasmin, perhaps, that we've worked together in city region food systems development for almost a decade now. And you've also worked in different parts of the world, Africa, Europe, and now in the Southwest. So I think you have a perspective that can add to both the perspectives we've just heard from. So the floor is yours.
Hey, thanks everybody, and happy spring. I don't know how well I can build on what I think both Yasmin and Peter have aptly mapped in sharing some of the complexities and the injustices that are at play in this drama, but also very much lucid and on target assessment of perhaps the odds, the longer arc of the role of science and the role of business and industry and the countercultural and countervailing critiques that are offered up by agroecology and other efforts. And finally, I think just picking up from where Peter left off, the rays of light that might be poking through all of this darkness in the pushback from local levels of governance. I preoccupy myself with thinking about the policy cascade, or what I would maybe otherwise describe as the nestedness of governance challenges, from global to national to regional and local. And maybe over the course of a career that has invested heavily at the micro and the macro, I'm coming around to a theory of change that sees things in both dimensions, that we have to think globally and act locally, but also in a temporal sense that we need to think historically and act immediately. We need to understand the urgency of the situation amidst all of this ecosystem collapse that we're witnessing, and think very much about where the defensible spaces, where the boundaries are that we can act, where our agency can really have the highest ratio of impact. We're not going to change the CGIAR system and all of its legacy right away, but as it becomes a shell of its former self, we might be able to pound on the alternative visions in science and popularize ways of thinking about our relationship to nature and our relationship to our food in new ways. I think that my experience more recently has given me some hope and some sense of possibility, working through networks of city regions or local authority networks that have both done their best to understand their relationship to the periphery around the city and to the hinterland, but also have started to build up their capacities to network with other cities and team up in the presence of the global processes as a single powerful voice. And this is something that Tom and I most recently witnessed, both in a expert group meeting in Spain around the question of territorial governance, but also the challenges of biodiversity and how local authorities might be better represented in global processes through the December meetings of the Global Convention on Biodiversity, and their moment of giving more voice and representation for local authorities. All this, how does it relate to food systems transformation? I think what we're seeing now is finally some understanding about how climate, biodiversity, and land degradation, or the three big Rio conventions, all can be better thought as having in common solutions in nature-based solutions. And I see that finally we're coming around to understanding the dreadful impact that a relatively short in historical terms experiment that we've been conducting on fossil fuel-based agriculture and monocrop systems is failing. That that what has been revealed with the Ukraine conflict and other recent past forces of climate-driven crop failures is that the global food system is quite brittle. It's quite again, through COVID and other shocks to the system, we've seen how many bottlenecks there are in the supply system, and how really short the appearance of empty shelves after the first failures or the secondary failures start to show that it's a precarious situation, the food supply we have. There's, in different contexts, culturally and politically, a range of solutions that local authorities have embarked on. We've talked already about public procurement, and we haven't gotten into experiments in community gardens and other strategies. But I think we're now at a stage where people are starting to link climate adaptation, climate justice, and the roles of public and private lands in mitigating some of the vulnerabilities we have to landslides or wildfires or other local or regional factors. And so people are starting to understand maybe there's a link between the food systems we promote and this vulnerability that we have to these disasters. So I'm witnessing efforts on the parts of municipalities to pull these elements together to try and understand how the food system and land use generally can be seen as a tool to create buffers or to create room to maneuver, in a sense, in the face of all these challenges. I'd like to, bringing to the focus the role of the private sector, suggest that we are at least in the US context, in a moment where there's a lot of interest in building tools. Tom, you've asked in your questions for evidence about accountable and robust changes in food production or marketing practices. I think a tool building exercise writ large is underway in the development of the Ecosystem Services Market Consortium, amongst others. There are lots of efforts to try and link environmental and social performance in the environment in working lands, and the metrics, the theories behind them, and the application of them is now broadly underway. The ESMC, for short, the consortium, has just produced something of great interest to me, a draft of a tool set for ranch lands, trying to understand whether we could create a verifiable system by which we would measure primarily carbon sequestration, but other ecosystem benefits as well in ranch lands. They start with private lands, but I think the future is to think about private and public lands. And the role that I think local authorities might play in that, I think is very tantalizing to think that in the case of Boulder, Colorado, it's one of the municipalities that I'm working with. There's a portfolio of protected areas that the city has, across its history, sought to protect. Their performance in terms of protecting this land is high, but their ability to make livelihoods, working lands, generate livelihoods for the people who are ranching and farming on them is still a work in progress. But I think as we start to see a portfolio of experiments and solutions around nature-based solutions, that these working lands, these protected areas, might be both amenities for recreation, sources of local food, and protectors of environmental services like flood control and pollinator habitat and buffers for wildfire and so forth. So I think there's evidence that these experiments are broadly taking root. The big question for me, at least in the US context, is how this policy cascade I talked about at the outset might unfold. How do we understand the aspirations and the intentions of signers of global treaties like federal governments work with local authorities to implement these strategies at a finer granularity, at a finer scale, at local and regional scale. And I think we're in an early phase where that experimentation is going to become the basis for learning and exchanging how to do this. So I'm maybe anticipating a little bit of the second and third questions that you have in future. Some of the work, if your syllabus is as written earlier, what you're going to touch upon perhaps a little bit later in your course as well, Tom.
Arthur, thanks a lot. There was a lot there. And we only have a few minutes left. I want to give Yasmin and Peter another minute or two each and wrap it up. But I think what you spoke about in terms of the shock therapy, if you will, of recent years that stimulate local efforts to address vulnerabilities of the food system, I think we see this, we're working with city networks, subnational networks, ICLEI, UCLG, Regions 4, others are, and now OECD is really also jumping in on supporting rural-urban partnerships for sustainable development, but it's where the traction is really at that local level. The tool building you just referred to is only part of it, I think. And the policy cascade downward, it sounds a lot like the instrumentalism of decentralist policy and the past, but really we're talking about something different here if it combines with a reverse flow upwards. And where does that,
Yes.
where does that really have impact and purchase is going to be different in different countries and different regions of the world, of course.
So we have a policy cascade and maybe a policy fountain as well.
A fountain. I was trying to figure out what the word was for a reverse cascade. Fountain is right. But Yasmin, do you see any way in which this, it's sort of like parallel universes here, any way in which some of this action can actually impact the debates going on in the follow-up to the Cornivia work stream, and whether food systems are really going to have purchase in an environment that refuses to even use the words fossil fuel. Can you see any light at the end of that tunnel?
Well, it's difficult to say, and I think there was a lot of talk in COP27 about like corporate presence from fossil fuels companies, but not so much about big industrial agriculture corporate presence, and there was, and I think that of course shapes the conversations that happen in these international spaces. I think that there has been quite an advancement in terms of the space that the agriculture conversation has gained in the past few years in the UNFCCC negotiations. But of course, it still remains like let's say the younger sibling of the topics in the agenda, because it's the one that does not have the attention, or not even like, I'm not talking about media attention, even from the countries, like the government representatives themselves, because it still remains a space in which not a lot of policy transformations seem to happen, or to like maybe happen in the future, not even now. So the conversation remains very technical, and discussions around whether we use manure or synthetic fertilizers, and what are the pros and cons from each of those practices. And of course, it's a relevant conversation to have, but I think at this point in time, I think we need to start having other types of discussions. And I maybe going back to the complexity that we were discussing at the beginning, I think that partly the fact that this kind of global approach maybe is not necessarily bringing the answers to the transformation of the food production and consumption system. I think maybe it is a space that can bring some political signals, but I don't think that the biggest transformations for this sector are going to come from the international multilateral space. And besides, there are many multilateral spaces which discuss food. Like, it's not just the UNFCCC, there is the CFS, and countries and representatives say different things into different spaces, which adds to the confusion. But yeah, I think that I wouldn't necessarily say that it's a pointless space. It's maybe it's not the one that we should expect the most or the biggest transformation at this point. And that's where I think the whole point of the conversation about how can we bring local governments and local stakeholders into the conversation really gains a lot of importance. Yeah.
Good. Yeah. Peter, do you have anything you'd like to add before we wrap?
Sure. Well, I think since we're also talking about climate change and the role of the private sector, I think it's important to acknowledge that the international system, which involves the United Nations and also the research institutions like CGIAR and the private sector, have done actually a pretty good job responding to global famine. That is, when you have examples of acute but localized food insecurity and hunger, the system has responded pretty well. That's comparatively, okay? As a UN function, compared to peacekeeping, for example, I would say that the World Food Program and others have done a pretty good job. And they've done so essentially taking a commodity approach, which is the export of excess production from bread baskets, from very fertile, very productive land. That is a very different than addressing low-level, chronic, generalized food insecurity, for which agroecology is a much better approach. That is, you're not taking commodities out of the bread baskets and moving them to vulnerable areas. You're helping vulnerable areas get less vulnerable. And I think that is a challenge that the private sector is unfortunately very poorly equipped to address. And I think that
the
UN
UN system. The
and the UN system.
Yeah.
So I think that's going to be one of our biggest challenges going forward. As food insecurity takes on new dimensions, not all of which are related to a lack of purchasing power. In many cases, we are going to be facing a supply crisis and not a purchasing power demand crisis. So I think those nuances will be important to track, and we're going to need some improved multilateral spaces, as Yasmin has described, to address that shift. Thanks.
A ministry of the future.
There you go.
So I want to thank you, all three of you, so much for this. I want to respect your time, and this has really been a wonderful conversation that we'll build on in different ways in the classroom, but also I look forward to building on them in the work that we're all doing with colleagues and others going forward. So I'm going to just thank you, and I wish you well, and I will end here if that's okay.
Thank you, Thomas.
Yeah.
Thanks, Sam.
Thank you.